The Geiger counter clipped to my chest rig wasn't just clicking anymore. It was practically screaming. A static-filled drone that cut through the silence of the Fukushima hills like a serrated knife. I dialed the volume down, relying on the vibration against my ribs to tell me if I was walking into a microwave. It had been 6 months since the extraction choppers left us behind. 6 months since the grid went down globally, turning the modern world into a graveyard. They called it a containment failure on the last broadcast I caught. We called it SHTF. And here, in the exclusion zone, the ghosts of 2011 were the least of my worries. My name is Nate. Former PMC, stuck on the wrong side of the Pacific when the world ended. I've been tracking a signal, a dead man switch broadcast on an encrypted frequency used by Protocol Black. That's the rumor, anyway. A shadow initiative between the US and Japan. Biological defense. Or offense. Depending on who you ask, and who's still alive to lie about it. The coordinates led me here. Not to the main reactors on the coast, but up into the dense, overgrown treeline of the hills. The map said nothing existed here but forest and wildlife preserves. The concrete wall looming out of the mist said otherwise. I checked my gear. My rifle, a scarred 18 Malawin Quachas I'd scavenged from a fallen comrade, felt heavy. The suppressor was fouled, but it would hold for a few more shots. I adjusted my plate carrier, the tan nylon stained with mud and old blood, some mine, mostly theirs. The infected. That's what we started calling them before the radios went dead. Not zombies. Not exactly. Something faster. Something that retained just enough muscle memory to open doors and hunt in packs. I breached the perimeter fence with bolt cutters, the snap echoing too loudly in the damp air. I waited. Counted to 30. Silence. Just the wind rustling the wet leaves and the distant caw of a crow. I moved forward, keeping low, practicing the slice-the-pie tactics that had kept me breathing this long. The facility emerged from the fog like a monolith. Brutalist architecture, stained with streaks of rust and moss. No windows on the ground floor. A single, massive blast door stood slightly ajar, the universal sign of a fatal funnel. If there was anything inside, it was waiting for me. I activated my weapon light, the beam cutting a cone through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, swirling around the distinct shape of a Japanese power plant logo, faded and peeling. But this wasn't for civilian power. The signage was dual language, English and Japanese. Authorized personnel only level 5 biosafety. Power plants don't have biosafety levels. I slipped inside. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. The smell hit me next, ozone, stale copper, and the unmistakable rot of something that had died a long time ago. The floor was slick with water pooling from a leak in the ceiling. My boots crunched on glass. Check your corners, I whispered to myself. A mantra. The lobby was a wreck. Overturned desks, shattered monitors. But no bodies. That was the first red flag. In a panic, people die where they stand. In a systematic purge, the bodies are moved. Or they get up and walk away. I moved toward a corridor marked Turbine Hall B. The walls here were lined with heavy cabling, thick as a man's arm, pulsed with a faint, dying hum. The facility wasn't dead. It was on standby. As I moved deeper, the architecture shifted. The industrial power plant aesthetic gave way to something clinical. Clean rooms. Airlocks. I found a clipboard on the floor next to a discarded hazmat suit. The suit had been torn open from the inside. I picked up the clipboard. The document was stamped Protocol Black. My hands shook slightly as I read the waterlogged text. It detailed a joint operation to weaponize the radiation of the exclusion zone, to create a biological agent that thrived in fallout. They weren't trying to cure anything. They were building a soldier that didn't need a hazmat suit. A noise. Sharp. Rhythmic. Metal on concrete. I froze, extinguishing my light. I crouched behind a heavy generator unit, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the darkness, my other senses took over. The smell of rot intensified. Scrape. Step. Scrape. Step. Something was dragging a leg. I peered around the generator. At the far end of the hall, illuminated by the flickering red emergency lights, a silhouette moved. It was human-shaped, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long. It wore the tattered remains of a lab coat, now black with grime. It stopped. It turned its head, twitching spasmodically. It didn't have eyes. Where the eyes should have been, there was only fungal growth, glowing with a faint, bioluminescent green, the color of radium. This was it. The result of Protocol Black. The infected here weren't just rabid. They were mutated by the very environment that was supposed to kill them. I raised my rifle, thumbing the selector switch to semi-auto. I needed the data in the lower levels. I needed to know if there was a cure, or at least a weapon to fight this. But to get there, I had to go through him. And as more silhouettes detached themselves from the shadows behind the first one, I realized he wasn't alone. The hive was awake. I took a breath, centered the reticle on the glowing mass of the lead creature's head, and squeezed the trigger. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The creature dropped, but the scream that answered from the depths of the plant wasn't human. It was the sound of a dinner bell ringing in hell. I racked the bolt. Let's get to work. The distinct crunch of tactical boots on shattered glass echoed from the catwalk above, shattering the dead silence of the turbine hall. I froze, pressing my body into the recess of a rusted cable tray, the cold steel biting into my cheek. I killed the lumen output on my headlamp, plunging myself into a darkness so absolute it felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against my eyes. My breathing became a conscious, manual effort, shallow pulls of air through the N95 filter. Terrified that the fabric's expansion would rustle against my jacket collar. I counted them. 3 distinct sets of footsteps. Heavy. Rhythmic. They weren't walking a beat, they were slicing the pie, moving in a bounding Overwatch formation. These weren't local Fukushima police or confused security guards. They were cleanup. My Geiger counter, clipped to my shoulder strap, let out a sharp, erratic click-click-click. I fumbled blindly to mute it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The radiation levels here were spiking, 3.8 microsieverts and climbing. We were standing in the throat of an invisible beast, and these men had walked right in. Through the grate of the cable tray, I saw the sweeping beams of infrared illuminators cutting through the dust motes. They were running quad-nod night vision. I was effectively blind, all they were seeing in high-definition monochrome. If I stayed here, I was dead. If I moved, I was dead. The only advantage I had was the facility's decay. The floor plans I had memorized from the urban exploration forums were useless. The 2011 quake had shifted the architecture, collapsing the main concourse into a twisted maw of rebar and concrete. That chaos was my cover. Sector 4 clear. Moving to the sublevel. A voice crackled. It was digitized, distorted by a heavy throat mic and encryption. They spoke Japanese, but the dialect was sharp, abbreviated, military shorthand. The footsteps moved away, towards the freight elevator shaft. I waited a full 2 minutes, counting down 120 heartbeats, before I dared to slide out of the tray. My muscles screamed in protest. I checked my gear, camera, backup drive, pry bar, and a canister of bear spray. Pathetic defenses against suppressed carbines, but it was all I had. I needed to get to the administrative wing. The logbook I'd glimpsed in the intake booth mentioned Protocol Black originating from the director's terminal. Whatever was happening here, whatever had warranted a kill squad in a dead zone, the answer was on a hard drive somewhere in the dark. I moved low, executing a duck walk that burned my quads, sticking to the shadows of the massive turbines. The air tasted of copper and ozone, the taste of ionization. The facility wasn't just dormant. It was leaking something that wasn't on the periodic table. I reached the blast door separating the turbine hall from the admin corridor. The electronic lock was dead, the keypad melted into a plastic slag. I wedged the pry bar into the seam. With a groan of tortured metal that sounded like a gunshot in the silence, I applied torque. The door gave way just enough for me to slip through. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The industrial hum was replaced by a sterile, suffocating stillness. Papers littered the floor, preserved in the dry air. I swept my flashlight beam quickly, on, scan, off. Tactical light discipline. In that brief flash, I saw the walls. They weren't just cracked, they were clawed. Deep, parallel gouges tore through the drywall, revealing the steel studs beneath. They were too wide for a bear, too precise for an earthquake. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature walked down my spine. I found the director's office at the end of the hall. The glass partition was blown out inwards. I vaulted the sill, glass crunching under my boots, wincing at the noise. I booted up my laptop, connecting it to the localized internet port on the desk. To my shock, the link light blinked green. The internal grid was still active. Independent power supply. Geothermal? Nuclear? I ran a brute force script on the password. While the progress bar crawled, I rifled through the physical files. Project Izanami. Biological yield. Containment failure rate, 100%. My hand shook as I picked up a dossier stamped with a red warning triangle. The photos clipped inside were grainy, low-light captures from security feeds. They showed personnel, researchers in hazmat suits, running. And behind them, blurred by motion, was something that looked like a man, but elongated, the limbs possessing too many joints. The skin a mottled gray canvas of tumors and lesions. Ping. Access granted. I turned to the screen. The logs for Protocol Black weren't a security measure for intruders. It was a containment procedure. Log entry November 3, 2011. Seismic event compromised the B-deck stasis tanks. Subject 0 is awake. Standard kill switch failed. Radiation is accelerating the mutation rather than killing the cells. We are sealing the exits. God forgive us, we are welding the doors from the outside. I felt the blood drain from my face. They didn't evacuate this plant. They buried it. And the squad downstairs? They weren't here to catch a trespasser. They were here to ensure the tomb stayed sealed. Suddenly, the sound of breaking glass from the hallway snapped me back. Not the crunch of feet, but the tinkling of a falling pane. I killed the screen, yanking the drive. I slid under the heavy oak desk, clutching the pry bar. A beam of light, white and blinding, swept the room. Not night vision this time. Weapon-mounted lights. Heat signature faded. He was here, a voice said inches from the doorframe. Check the vents. Command wants the witness sterilized. No leaks. I held my breath until my lungs burned. They were sweeping the room. I could see the toe of a boot, black leather, caked in gray dust, step into the room. Then another. They were moving in a pincer. I had seconds. My eyes darted to the corner of the room. A maintenance hatch. It was bolted shut, but the rust had eaten the hinges. If I could cause a distraction. I reached into my bag and grabbed a road flare. I didn't light it. The strike cap was too loud. Instead, I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the underside of the desk. I calculated the trajectory. Through the broken window, into the hallway, bouncing off the far wall. I threw it. Clack thud. Contact left! The room erupted. Suppressed gunfire thwip chewed into the drywall in the hallway. In the chaos of their pivot, I kicked the maintenance hatch. It gave way with a screech. I dove headfirst into the crawlspace just as the desk above me splintered under a hail of 5.56 rounds. I scrambled on elbows and knees, the jagged metal of the ductwork tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I heard the shouting change from tactical commands to something else, confusion. Target enters the ventilation, wait. Movement on the thermal. Multiple contacts. 12 o'clock. That's not the target. That's, open fire. Open fire. The gunfire intensified, becoming a frantic, full-auto roar. Then screams. Not the screams of men being shot, but wet, gurgling sounds of things being torn apart. I didn't stop to look back. I crawled deeper into the dark, the sounds of the slaughter echoing through the tin tunnel. I checked my compass. The duct was heading down. Deeper. Towards the B-deck. Towards the source. Protocol Black wasn't about keeping people out. It was about keeping the residents of the basement in. And I was heading right for their front door. The red emergency lighting of sublevel 3 didn't just illuminate the corridor, it seemed to pressurize it, turning the stagnant air into a heavy, suffocating blanket. My breathing was the loudest thing in the world, a harsh, rhythmic rasp amplified by the claustrophobic confines of the full-face respirator. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating concrete of a support pillar, forcing my heart rate to decelerate. Panic burns oxygen, and down here, oxygen was a finite resource. I checked the readout on my wrist-mounted Geiger counter. The display flickered, the LCD struggling against some unseen magnetic interference, but the numbers were clear enough for 2 microsieverts per hour. It was climbing. Not linearly, but exponentially. The facility wasn't just leaking, it was bleeding. I adjusted the strap on my pack, ensuring the carabiners were taped down to prevent metallic clinking. Silence was survival. The footsteps I had heard 3 floors up were no longer a distant echo. They were precise, coordinated, and heavy. These weren't the scuffling steps of looters or the cautious tread of urban explorers. This was the rhythmic, stomping cadence of military-grade saws impacting steel grating. I killed the lumen on my tactical light, plunging myself into the crimson gloom. My eyes strained to adjust, picking out the shapes of industrial piping that snaked along the ceiling like the intestines of some leviathan machine. From my vantage point behind a rusted hydraulic manifold, I had a line of sight down the main arterial hallway leading to the coolant pumping station. Shadows detached themselves from the darkness at the far end. 3 figures. Even through the haze and the poor lighting, the silhouette of their gear was unmistakable. High-cut ballistic helmets with mounted nods, night vision optical devices, flipped down, glowing with that faint, predatory green phosphor. They wore bulky plate carriers, likely level 4 ceramic given the threat profile, and carried short-barreled carbines with suppressors the size of soda cans. They moved in a standard bounding Overwatch formation. 1 moved while 2 covered sectors of fire. Professional. Lethal. This was a sanitization team. Sector 4 Alpha clear. A voice crackled. It wasn't over a radio. It was external amplification from a helmet comm system, echoing slightly in the corridor. Radiation levels nominal for Zone Red. No sign of the intruder yet. Check the vents. A second voice commanded, deeper, distorted by a rebreather. Command says the thermal signature spiked near the heat exchangers. If he's here, he's cooking. I froze. My own thermal signature. They weren't just hunting with flashlights. They were using thermal imagers. The heavy rubberized canvas of my hazmat suit offered some insulation, but eventually, my body heat would bleed through. I needed to mask my temperature, and fast. I looked to my left. A burst steam pipe was venting a steady plume of superheated vapor near the floor. It was dangerous. 1 slip and I'd boil inside my suit, but the heat bloom would flare white-hot on their optics, effectively blinding them to my presence if I stayed directly behind the plume. I moved. Low crawl. Elbows and knees. The concrete scraped against my shin guards. I slid behind the wall of hissing steam just as the sweeping beam of an IR illuminator slashed across the spot I had occupied seconds prior. The heat was intense, instantly fogging the edges of my visor. I blinked the sweat out of my eyes, gripping the handle of the pry bar I'd salvaged from the maintenance locker. Against operators like that, it was a toothpick, but it was all I had. Through the veil of steam, I watched them pass. They didn't sweep my corner. The thermal interference from the leak shielded me. As the point man passed, I noticed a patch on his shoulder. No flag. No unit insignia. Just a simple, matte black circle with a jagged white line running through it. Protocol Black. It wasn't just a file name, it was an organization, or perhaps a designation for a specific kind of cleanup crew. The kind that didn't take prisoners. Once the heavy thud of their boots faded toward the turbine hall, I moved in the opposite direction, heading deeper into the facility's gut. I needed to find the source of the radiation spike. The files I glanced at in the control room mentioned a containment vault 02 located in the sub-basement. That's where the data, and the danger, would be. The architecture changed as I descended the service ladder to sub-level 4. The industrial utilitarianism of the power plant gave way to something more sterile, yet infinitely more decayed. The walls here were lined with lead and thick polymer sheeting. But the sheeting was torn, shredded from the inside out. And then I saw it. The substance. It started as a stain on the floor, black and viscous, like crude oil mixed with tar. But as I followed the trail, the physics of it stopped making sense. The black sludge climbed the walls in defiance of gravity, forming intricate, fractal patterns that looked disturbingly like a nervous system. I brought my face closer to a patch of it on the wall, my respirator humming. The Geiger counter screamed, 12 microsieverts. This stuff was radioactive. But it was also growing. Tiny filaments, thinner than hair, were undulating, reaching out into the air as if tasting it. Protocol Black wasn't a meltdown. It was an infection. I reached a heavy blast door labeled Vault 02 Bioradiological Storage. The locking mechanism had been bypassed, the heavy steel warped as if something tremendous had punched it from the inside. I squeezed through the gap, my suit snagging on jagged metal. Inside, the room was a nightmare of shattered glass and flickering strobes. Rows of cylindrical containment tanks lined the walls. Most were broken. Fluid pooled on the floor, mixing with the black sludge. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, erratic spotlight, was a desk. A corpse sat in the chair. It wasn't decayed. It was mummified, encased in the hard, resin-like shell of the black substance. The poor soul's hand was fused to a ruggedized laptop. The screen was dead, but the hard drive indicator light blinked rhythmically. A beacon. I approached the desk, stepping carefully over the pools of necrotic fluid. I needed that drive. If I could extract the data, I'd have proof. I reached for the laptop, my gloved fingers hovering over the ports. Suddenly, a sound froze my blood. Not the soldiers. Not the machinery. A wet, guttural chittering. Coming from the ceiling. I slowly tilted my head back. Above me, clinging to the overhead pipes, was a mass of shadows. It shifted, uncoiling. It was roughly humanoid, but the anatomy was all wrong. The limbs were too long, possessing extra joints. Its skin was the same matte black texture as the sludge, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Where a face should have been, there was only a cluster of sensory fissures glowing with faint Cherenkov radiation, a sickly, pale blue. It dropped. I threw myself backward, crashing into a rack of servers as the creature slammed into the desk, shattering the mummified corpse. The laptop skittered across the floor. The creature shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and turned its eyeless head toward me. It could smell the isotopes in my suit. It tracked radiation. I scrambled for the pry bar, my boots slipping in the slime. The creature lunged, its elongated arms swinging like a scythe. I ducked, feeling the wind of the blow, and swung the bar with everything I had. It connected with the creature's midsection with a dull thud, not like hitting flesh, but like hitting a sandbag filled with wet clay. The creature didn't even flinch. It backhanded me, sending me flying across the room. I hit the wall hard, the breath driven from my lungs. My vision swam. The respirator alarm beeped, seal compromised. Just as the creature reared up for a killing strike, the room exploded in light and noise. Asterisk crack thump. Crack thump. Asterisk. Suppressed gunfire. The tactical team. I looked toward the breached door. The 3 operators were there, weapons raised, firing in controlled bursts. The bullets impacted the creature, blowing chunks of black viscous matter into the air. The creature screeched, turning its aggression toward the new threat. It leaped, closing the distance to the soldiers with terrifying speed. Contact front! Target Black 1! Engage! The point man yelled, his composure cracking slightly. Chaos erupted. The soldiers scattered, their tactical cohesion breaking under the ferocity of the assault. One operator was grabbed by the leg and tossed into a bank of capacitors, sparks showering down. The other 2 poured fire into the beast, their rounds glowing with tracers. I didn't watch the fight. I saw my window. The laptop was lying near the door, dangerously close to the melee. I forced my bruised body to move. I crawled, keeping low, the noise of the battle deafening, screams, animalistic roars, and the constant percussion of carbine fire. I grabbed the laptop, shoving it into my pack. I looked up just in time to see the creature pin one of the soldiers to the ground. The operator pulled a pin on a grenade at his vest. "Frag out!" he screamed. I dove through the warped blast door just as the concussion wave hit. The explosion rocked the foundation of the sublevel, dust and debris billowing out into the corridor. My ears rang. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling away from the vault. The shooting had stopped. The screaming had stopped. I checked the respirator. A hairline crack in the faceplate, but the pressure seal was holding. I checked the Geiger counter. 5 microsieverts. I was taking a dose, but I was alive. I had the drive. I had the truth of Protocol Black in my backpack. But now, I was trapped between a dead end and a room full of corpses and a monster that might not be dead. I looked down the corridor. A service map on the wall indicated a secondary coolant flush tunnel that led to the sea outflow. It was a desperate route, likely flooded. Definitely radioactive. But it was the only way out that didn't lead back to the tactical teams sweeping the upper levels. I tightened my straps, gripped the pry bar, and started to run. The mystery of the plant was no longer a curiosity. It was a death sentence, and the executioners were closing in from both sides. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door sealing shut offered a momentary, deceptive sense of safety. I leaned my back against the cold steel, sliding down until my boots hit the grate floor. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps, fogging the faceplate of my respirator. I ripped the mask off, gambling on the air quality of the command center. The Geiger counter on my shoulder strap was chirping a frantic, erratic rhythm, 3.8 microsieverts per hour. High, but immediate acute radiation sickness wasn't the primary threat anymore. The things in the hallway were. I needed to stabilize. Tactical breathing, 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds out. The adrenaline dump was making my hands shake, a tremor that would be fatal if I didn't get it under control. I checked the SIG P226. The slide was cool to the touch. I ejected the mag, 7 rounds left. 1 in the chamber. 8 total. I had 2 spare magazines on my belt, but in a firefight against fast movers, reloading was a luxury I likely wouldn't get. I clicked the safety back on and holstered it, pulling the tactical flashlight from my vest. I kept the beam low, sweeping the floor. I was in what looked like a localized security hub for Sector 4. The architecture here shifted from the utilitarian concrete of the upper plant to something more sterile, more clinical. Brushed aluminum walls, now tarnished by oxidation and mold. Japanese warning signs littered the floor, but the kanji was different here. It wasn't the standard TEPCO warnings for high voltage or radiation. These were military-grade classification markers. Biocontainment Level 5. Authorized lethal force. The room was dominated by a bank of CRT monitors, most of them shattered or dead. One, however, flickered with a ghostly green phosphor glow in the corner. I moved toward it, my boots crunching on broken glass and desiccated rat droppings. The console was hooked up to an independent power supply, likely a decaying isotope generator that had been humming in the dark for a decade. I wiped the dust from the screen. It was a login prompt, frozen in time. The last entry date, March 12, 2011. The day after the quake. The day the world looked away. I bypassed the admin lock. The encryption was archaic, standard outdated government algorithms. As the file directory cascaded down the screen, the mystery of Protocol Black began to unravel, and the horror of my situation solidified. This wasn't just a power plant. It never was. The Fukushima Daiichi facility was a massive energy generator, yes, but the hills behind it, where I stood now, housed a joint black site project dating back to the late 80s. Project Izanami. I opened a file labeled Subject 82 Autopsy. The text was dry, clinical, and terrifying. The researchers weren't studying the effects of radiation on the human body to cure it. They were studying it to weaponize it. They had discovered a gene sequence in local fauna that, when exposed to massive doses of cesium-137, didn't break down, it hyper-regenerated. Protocol Black was the initiative to splice that sequence into human combatants. The goal was to create soldiers who could operate in nuclear wastelands, repairing their own cellular damage in real time. But the quake shattered the containment seals. The core meltdown didn't kill the subjects in the sublevels. It fed them. A metallic clang from the ventilation shaft above me snapped my focus back to the room. The sound was wet, heavy, like a slab of meat being slapped against sheet metal. I killed the flashlight immediately, plunging the room into darkness save for the eerie green light of the terminal. I drew the SIG, moving silently away from the console, putting a heavy server rack between me and the vent. The noise grew louder. Scrabbling. Claws on steel. They had found a bypass. The blast door was impenetrable, but the HVAC system was a highway for these things. My eyes adjusted to the gloom. I saw the vent grate vibrate. A screw popped loose, pinging off the floor. Then another. The grate swung down, hanging by a single hinge. Silence. Then, a fluid, elongated shape poured out of the hole. It hit the floor in a crouch, barely making a sound. In the green wash of the monitor, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was vaguely humanoid, but the anatomy was all wrong. The arms were too long, ending in calcified, bone-like protrusions instead of fingers. The skin was translucent, revealing a road map of black veins pulsing underneath. It wore the tattered remnants of a SHTF fatigue uniform, fused into its flesh. It sniffed the air, its head twitching with bird-like speed. It couldn't see me. The cataracts over its eyes suggested blindness. But it could smell the sweat, the fear, the blood from the scrape on my arm. I leveled the pistol, aiming for center mass, then corrected. The files said they regenerated. Body shots would just piss it off. I needed to sever the brain stem. The creature turned its head sharply toward the server rack. It knew. It shrieked, a sound that was half human scream, half grinding metal, and lunged. I squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash was blinding in the dark room. Asterisk crack. Crack. Asterisk. The first round took it in the shoulder, spinning it midair. It didn't even slow down. It crashed into the rack, sending servers toppling. I rolled to the left, narrowly avoiding a swipe from those bone claws that gouged deep furrows into the aluminum floor. I scrambled back, raising the weapon again. The creature was already up, the wound in its shoulder knitting together with a sickening wet sound, steam rising from the injury. It hissed, exposing rows of needle teeth. "Die, you ugly bastard!" I whispered. I lined up the tritium sights on the bridge of its nose. I fired a double tap. The first shot shattered its jaw. The second punched through the orbital socket. The creature's head snapped back violently, black ichor spraying the wall behind it. It collapsed, twitching, legs kicking in a death spasm before going still. I didn't lower the gun. I held my aim for 10 seconds. 20. When it didn't rise, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I moved to the body, keeping the gun trained on it. Up close, the smell was atrocious, ozone and rotting meat. I nudged it with my boot. Dead. Truly dead. But the noise in the vents hadn't stopped. It had changed. More were coming. I scrambled back to the terminal. I didn't have time to read everything, so I pulled the hard drive from the tower, shoving it into my tactical pouch. As I turned to leave, my light swept over the far corner of the room, illuminating something I had missed in my initial sweep. A body. Not one of them. A human. He was slumped against the wall, dressed in black tactical gear that looked surprisingly modern. High-end plate carrier, night vision goggles shattered on the floor, and a patch on his shoulder that I didn't recognize. A black triangle with a red lightning bolt. I checked his pockets. No ID. Just a localized map of the facility laminated in plastic. I shined my light on it. Someone had marked a route in red marker, leading from this room down to sub-level 3. The destination was circled, the incubator. Underneath the circle, scribbled in shaky handwriting, were 3 words, *, destroy the source. *. The vents rattled violently, the metal groaning under the weight of multiple heavy bodies. They were swarming. I looked at the blast door, locked from the outside now. I looked at the vent, death. My only option was the service elevator shaft the dead soldier had been crawling towards. The doors were pried open, revealing a black abyss and a rusted ladder descending into the bowels of the earth. The screeching grew deafening. A second grate across the room burst open. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the dead soldier's map, swung my legs over the lip of the elevator shaft, and began to climb down into the dark, leaving the safety of the control room behind. The deeper I went, the hotter the air became, and the Geiger counter on my chest began to climb again, ticking up and up and up. The service corridor smelled of stagnant water, copper, and the distinct, ozone-sharp tang of high-voltage ionization. I pressed my back against the cold concrete of the alcove, counting the beats of my own heart as they thundered against my ribs. It was an erratic rhythm, fueled by adrenaline and the creeping, insidious dread that the Geiger counter clipped to my chest rig was screaming in silence. I had cut the speaker wire an hour ago. Audio discipline was the only thing keeping me alive. But the LCD display was a frantic blur. 0. 85 sieverts per hour. Not enough to drop me instantly, but enough that I could taste the metal in my saliva. My time in this facility was measured in cellular decay. From around the corner, the rhythmic thud hiss of hydraulic movement echoed. It wasn't just heavy boots, it was assisted movement. The sweep team I had narrowly avoided in the turbine hall wasn't local law enforcement, and they certainly weren't standard SHTF. They were wearing sealed combat environmental suits with exoskeletal bracing. I had caught a glimpse of them through the grating of the mezzanine, matte black armor, no insignias. Carrying suppressed carbines that looked like heavy-caliber variants designed to punch through concrete. They moved with the terrifying coordination of a hive mind, checking corners, clearing sectors. This was a sanitization operation. I checked my weapon, a pry bar I'd salvaged from a maintenance locker. Against thermal optics and ceramic plates, it was a joke, but it was all I had for leverage. My real weapon was the facility's layout, downloaded to my phone before the signal died. I needed to get to Sector 4, the sub-level control. That's where the Protocol Black origin point was marked on the schematics I'd found in the security booth. I waited for the heavy footsteps to pass. The lead element of the sweep team paused at the intersection, 10 meters from my hiding spot. I held my breath, squeezing my eyes shut as a beam of high-intensity tactical light swept across the wall opposite me. The dust motes dancing in the beam looked like jagged shards of glass. If they had thermal, I was dead. But the ambient heat of the plant, the leaking steam pipes and the overheating machinery that should have been dormant for a decade, masked my signature. The footsteps resumed, fading down the hall toward the reactor vessel. I moved. Low crouch, weight on the balls of my feet, rolling the steps to silence the gravel crunch. I slipped into a rusted service hatch, wrenching the wheel lock with a groan of corroded metal. It gave way, and I slid into the ventilation crawlspace, pulling the hatch shut behind me just as the radio chatter of the sweep team echoed back down the hall. They had doubled back. The crawlspace was a nightmare of claustrophobia. It was lined with asbestos wrapping and dripping with condensation that I prayed wasn't radioactive runoff. I crawled on my elbows, the respirator mask chafing my skin. The air filters were rated for 12 hours. I had maybe 3 left. As I shimmied forward, the mystery of Protocol Black gnawed at me. The documents in the upper offices spoke of a secondary containment failure in 2011, hours after the tsunami. But the official reports said this plant was offline for maintenance during the disaster. The logs I saw mentioned biological uptake and accelerated mutation. They weren't just generating power here. They were testing what happens to biological agents when exposed to corium-level radiation. I reached a vent grate looking down into a server room. It wasn't dark. Emergency red lighting bathed the room in the color of dried blood. I carefully unscrewed the corners of the grate with the edge of a coin, my multi-tool having been lost in the scramble at the perimeter fence, and dropped into the room. It was silent, save for the hum of a single terminal that was still drawing power from an auxiliary backup. I approached the console. The screen was burned in with a single prompt, *Protocol Black, Stage 4 Sterilization. I sat in the chair, the leather cracking under my weight, and tapped the keyboard. The system was air-gapped, locked down. But the previous user hadn't logged out. They had died at the keyboard. A skeletal figure, draped in a rotting lab coat, was slumped in the corner of the room, a pistol on the floor near its hand. The ID badge read Dr. K. Sato, Director of Biological Containment Star. I ignored the corpse and scrolled through the logs. The text was a descent into madness. March 14, 2011, containment breach in Sector 7. The rhizome samples have reacted to the radiation spike. Growth rate is up 4,000%. It's eating the shielding. March 15, 2011, communications cut. Tokyo thinks we are just dealing with a meltdown. They don't know about the organism. If the rhizome breaches the water table, it won't just be radiation poisoning. It will be an ecological rewrite. Asterisk. Asterisk March 16, 2011, initiating Protocol Black. The facility is to be sealed from the inside. Automated turrets active. Oxygen scrubbers reversed to pump halon. We are burying this. God forgive us. Asterisk. I stared at the screen. The black wasn't just a code for silence, it was a code for a tomb. The sweep team upstairs wasn't here to rescue anyone or retrieve data. They were here to ensure the tomb remained sealed. And they were likely planting charges to collapse the hillside on top of us. A sharp clack of a relay switching broke my concentration. The terminal screen flashed red. Asterisk unauthorized access detected. Purge system activated. Asterisk. The vents I had just crawled through slammed shut with magnetic locks. A hiss of gas began to fill the room, not halon this time, but something yellow and heavy. Chlorine? Mustard gas? I didn't wait to find out. I scanned the room for an exit. The main door was mag-locked. I grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, swung it with all my strength, and smashed the glass of the observation window overlooking the server farm below. I vaulted through the shattered pane, glass crunching under my boots, landing on the raised floor of the server room. The fall jarred my spine, but I scrambled up. The gas was pouring into the upper room, heavier than air, beginning to spill over the ledge like a toxic waterfall. I ran. I burst into the hallway leading to the heavy water storage. My dosimeter was now vibrating against my chest, a tactile alarm indicating a spike to 2.0 sieverts. I was getting close to the source. The rhizome. Suddenly, a laser dot danced across the wall next to my head. Contact front! A synthesized voice barked. I dove shoulder first into an open doorway as bullets shredded the drywall where I had been standing. The sound was deafening in the confined space, the supersonic cracks of the rounds mixing with the concrete dust. I rolled, coming up behind a heavy steel desk. The room was a break room, frozen in time, half-eaten instant noodles, a calendar from 2011. Target isolated. Room 404. Deploying gas, the voice said. No negotiation. No surrender. Just extermination. I looked around frantically. There was no other door. But there was a dumbwaiter in the corner, likely used to move supplies between the labs and the mess hall. It was small, barely 2 feet by 2 feet. I scrambled toward it, jamming the pry bar into the tracks to force the rusted doors open. A canister clattered into the room behind me, spewing white smoke. CS gas mixed with a sedative agent. My vision began to swim immediately, despite the mask. I shoved my pack into the dumbwaiter shaft, then contorted my body to squeeze inside. It was a tight fit, my shoulders scraping the metal sides. I grabbed the cables, greased and slick, and began to slide down, kicking the door shut with my boot just as the room filled with the opaque white fog. I slid down into the darkness, the cable burning my gloves. I descended past 1 floor, then 2. The air grew hotter, more humid. The smell of ozone vanished, replaced by the smell of wet earth and rotting vegetation, an impossible scent for a concrete bunker. I hit the bottom with a jarring thud, tumbling out onto a metal grating. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom and revealed something that made my blood run cold. The walls of this lower level weren't concrete anymore. They were covered in a thick, pulsating black biomass. Veins the size of tree trunks ran along the ceiling, glowing with a faint, Cherenkov blue luminescence. This was the rhizome. It hadn't just survived the radiation, it was feeding on it. And in the center of the mass, blocking the path to the reactor control, was a shape that looked vaguely, horrifyingly, like the sweep team armor, but fused into the wall, consumed and repurposed. I checked my ammo count on the pry bar, one swing left in me before exhaustion set in. I checked the Geiger counter, high. I checked the map on my phone. The only way out was through the reactor core, past the heart of the growth. Above me, in the shaft, I heard the zip-line cables of the pursuit team engaging. They were coming down. I took a breath of the stale, spore-heavy air, tightened my grip on the steel bar, and stepped off the grating into the biological nightmare of Level 5. The air in Sublevel 3 tasted of copper pennies and ozone, a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat and made me want to retch. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating concrete of a support pillar, willing my heart to stop hammering against my ribs. The silence down here wasn't empty. It was heavy, pressurized by millions of tons of earth and the lingering spectral weight of the isotopes decaying all around us. My Geiger counter, clipped to my shoulder strap, was vibrating frantically. I'd muted the audio alarm, but the tactile feedback was a constant. Terrifying reminder that my time was measured in sieverts, not minutes. 20 meters down the corridor, the beam of a tactical light sliced through the stagnant dust. It wasn't the erratic, searching wander of a flashlight. It was the disciplined, predatory sweep of a weapon-mounted Surefire. The cleaners were here. When I'd found the perimeter fence cut 3 hours ago, I thought I was following other urban explorers. When I found the body in the airlock with a bullet hole in the back of his tactical vest, I realized I'd walked into a kill box. I checked the P226 pistol I'd scavenged from the dead man. The slide was cold, the grip gritty with dried blood. 7 rounds in the magazine. 1 in the chamber. Against a paramilitary hit squad outfitted with thermal optics and level 4 body armor, I might as well have been holding a stapler. But the weight of it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. Check the vents, a voice crackled over a radio, distorted but dangerously close. Command wants 0 containment breaches. Protocol Black is in effect. If it moves, burn it. Protocol Black. I'd seen the phrase stenciled on the blast doors of the loading bay, but seeing it action was different. It implied a scorched earth policy that had nothing to do with nuclear safety. I slid down the wall, crouching low, and crab walked backward into the shadows of an open maintenance hatch. The room beyond was a tangle of rusted pipes and server racks, the blinking LEDs long since dead. I needed intel. I needed to know why a decommissioning team was hunting people like sport. I moved deeper into the server room, my boots rolling heel to toe to dampen the sound on the linoleum. The radiation levels here were higher. My skin felt hot, a sunburn developing in real time beneath my jacket. In the center of the room, illuminated by the faint, dying glow of an emergency backup strip, lay a heavy-duty terminal. It was hardlined into the facility's intranet, a relic of the 90s retrofitted with modern encryption hardware. I didn't have the time or the skills to hack a military-grade firewall, but I didn't have to. The terminal had been left logged in. The user, a Dr. Ishida, was slumped in the chair, his head resting on the keyboard. Rigor mortis had set in. I gently pushed the chair back, trying to ignore the gruesome reality of the suicide, and looked at the screen. The document open was titled Containment Failure Report, Asset 89. I scrolled, my eyes scanning the bureaucratic text that hid a nightmare. Date, March 12, 2011. Status, critical. Event, seismic activity compromised containment unit 4 Alpha. Note, the meltdown of Reactor 4 is to be used as cover for the sterilization of the lower labs. The public will believe it is radiation. The exclusion zone will ensure no witnesses approach the facility. Update. Current Asset 89 has metabolized the corium. Growth rate accelerated by 400%. Conventional small arms ineffective. Recommendation. Initiate Protocol Black. Total facility collapse required. My blood ran cold. The Fukushima disaster, the earthquake, the tsunami, they were real, but this facility, they had used the catastrophe as a smokescreen. While the world watched the cooling towers vent steam, something else was happening down here in the dark. Something biological. Something that ate radiation and grew. A heavy thud echoed from the corridor I had just left. Then a scream, short, wet, and abruptly cut off. The gunfire started a second later. It wasn't the rhythmic popping of suppressed pistols. It was the roar of automatic rifles, panicked and uncontrolled. The cleaners weren't shooting at me. I scrambled away from the terminal, ducking behind a row of rusted server towers. The noise in the hallway was deafening, shouts, the percussive thumps of grenades, and a sound that didn't belong in a concrete bunker, a low, chittering hiss that sounded like steam escaping high-pressure valves, but organic. Wet. Through the open maintenance hatch, I saw the beam of a flashlight violently jerk upwards as its owner was lifted off the ground. The soldier was screaming, firing his rifle blindly into the ceiling. Then, he was pulled up into the darkness of the ventilation clearance above the drop ceiling. Blood sprayed across the floor in a heavy arc, black in the dim light. I didn't wait to see what had taken him. I bolted for the rear exit of the server room. The tactical situation had shifted. I wasn't just hiding from a death squad anymore. I was trapped in a cage with the thing they had failed to kill. I burst into the rear corridor, sprinting. My breath rasped in my lungs, the air quality so poor now that my vision was tunneling. I needed to get to the elevator shaft in Sector D. According to the map I'd memorized on the upper levels, it was the only vertical access point that hadn't been sealed with concrete. I turned a corner and skidded to a halt. A barricade had been erected here, sandbags, folding tables, crates of equipment. Behind it lay two more bodies of the paramilitary team. They looked like they had been torn apart by heavy machinery. Their armor was shredded, ceramic plates shattered like pottery. I vaulted the barricade, my boots slipping on the slick floor. I grabbed a dropped flare from the ground, a red magnesium stick, and jammed it into my belt. A weapon? Maybe. A distraction? Definitely. Ahead, the corridor widened into the turbine hall. This was it. The vast, cavernous space was filled with the dormant giants of the power plant's generators. The catwalks above were a maze of shadows. I slowed my pace, raising the P-226. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but running meant noise, and noise meant death. Sector cleared, a voice crackled from a radio on one of the dead men behind me. Team 2 report. Team 2? Silence. Then, a sound from the catwalk directly above me. The metal groaned, stressing under a massive weight. Dust drifted down, catching in the beam of my small flashlight. I killed the light instantly, plunging myself into absolute darkness. I held my breath, listening. Asterisk click-clack. Click-clack. Asterisk. It sounded like claws on steel. Heavy, sharp, and purposeful. It was moving directly over my position. I crouched, making myself as small as possible against the turbine housing. The creature was hunting. It wasn't mindless. It was sweeping the area, just like the soldiers had. I needed to cross 50 meters of open floor to reach the service elevator. In the dark, it was suicide. With a light, it was suicide. My hand brushed against a valve wheel on the turbine housing. A steam release? If there was any pressure left in the geothermal loops. It was a gamble. A massive one. But I needed cover. I gripped the wheel, rust flaking off under my gloves, and hauled it counterclockwise with everything I had. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a shudder ran through the floor. A hiss started, low and building rapidly into a scream. A jet of superheated steam blasted out from a rupture in the pipe 10 feet away, filling the space between me and the creature with a wall of white. Scalding fog. The noise was deafening, masking my footsteps. I ran. I sprinted blindly into the steam, the heat searing my face. I could hear the creature shrieking above the noise of the escaping gas, a sound that vibrated in my teeth. It dropped from the ceiling, landing with a ground-shaking impact where I had been standing seconds ago. I didn't look back. I hit the far wall, fumbling for the door handle. It was locked. Damn it! I shouted, racking the slide of the pistol. I aimed at the lock mechanism and fired twice. The shots rang out, swallowed by the steam. I kicked the door, and it swung open, revealing the elevator shaft. The car was gone, fallen to the bottom years ago. Only the cables remained, hanging into the abyss like dead vines. Behind me, the steam cloud swirled. A shape was emerging. Tall, multi-limbed, its silhouette jagged and wrong. It had too many joints. I didn't hesitate. I holstered the gun, grabbed the greasy, steel cable, and jumped into the void. The friction burned through my gloves instantly. I slid down 10, 20 feet before I managed to clamp my boots against the cable to brake. The jolt nearly dislocated my shoulder. I swung there, dangling in the pitch black of the shaft, gasping for air. Above me, the door was torn off its hinges. A face, pale, eyeless, and split by a vertical mouth filled with needle teeth, peered into the shaft. It shrieked, a sound of pure frustration, echoing down the concrete tube. I hung still, letting the darkness swallow me. I was alive. But as I looked down, my dosimeter began to buzz again, harder this time. The red light on the device blinked rapidly in the dark. I wasn't climbing out. I was climbing down. Straight toward the core. Straight toward the nest. The air in Sector 4 tasted distinctively like copper and ozone. Filtering through the activated charcoal of my mask with a granular resistance that made every breath a labor. The digital readout on my wrist flickered in the gloom, 2 sieverts per hour. Lethal in sustained doses, but the invisible sleet of radiation was currently the least of my worries. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the Mk4 containment droid, I had mentally dubbed it the Ronin, echoed off the reinforced concrete walls of the turbine hall. It wasn't patrolling for leaks anymore. It was hunting. I pressed my back against the cold steel of a condensation tank, checking the magazine of my suppressed P226. 3 rounds. A useless gesture against the ceramic composite plating of a military-grade Sentinel. But comfort is found in strange places when you're bleeding from the shoulder. The graze was shallow, a lucky miss from the automated sentry gun in the airlock, but the suit's integrity was compromised. A layer of duct tape and silent prayer were the only things holding the fabric together against the ambient toxicity. Protocol Black initiated, the PA system announced. The voice was synthetic, calm, and utterly devoid of the horror it was unleashing. Biological contaminant detected in sublevel 3. Sterilization sequence engaging in T-10 minutes. Sterilization. That was the euphemism they used in the logs I'd found upstairs. It didn't mean bleach and UV lights. It meant thermobaric venting. They were going to cook the facility from the inside out to ensure whatever secrets were buried here stayed buried. I needed to move. The schematic on my tablet, the screen spiderwebbed with cracks but still functional, showed a maintenance lift 400 meters north. Past the dormant generator coils. It was a straight shot through a kill zone. I slid a flashbang from my belt, my last one. The pin felt cold against my gloved thumb. I timed the footsteps. Thud. Hiss. Thud. Hiss. The Ronin was venting heat. That was its weakness. The thermal exhaust ports on the rear chassis. If I could get behind it, I could jam the pry bar into the intake fans. Suicide tactics, but the alternative was being cooked alive by the sterilization protocol. I rolled out. The Ronin pivoted with terrifying grace, its sensor cluster glowing a hateful red in the gloom. I tossed the flashbang. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, a whiteout of magnesium that overloaded the drone's optical sensors. It shrieked, audio receptors feedbacking in a piercing electronic squeal. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted, boots slipping on the oily grate. I hit the drone like a linebacker, driving the pry bar into the venting slat with every ounce of desperate strength I possessed. Metal screeched, Sparks showered down like fireworks, and the machine seized. Hydraulic fluid, hot and black, sprayed across my visor. I didn't stop to watch it die. I scrambled over the twitching wreckage, sprinting for the heavy bulkhead door at the far end. My lungs burned. The Geiger counter was screaming now. 5 sieverts. I was moving closer to the core. The door was sealed. Mag-locked. I pulled the interface cable from my wrist computer and jacked into the panel. "Come on!" I hissed, sweat stinging my eyes. The decryption software chewed through the encryption keys. This was 1990s tech overlaid with modern military-grade IC, intrusion countermeasures electronics. A strange hybrid. Who had upgraded this place? The lock disengaged with a heavy clank. I threw my weight against the wheel, spinning it. The door groaned open, revealing a corridor bathed in emergency amber lighting. I slipped inside and sealed it behind me, collapsing against the metal. Safe. For a moment. This hallway was different. The walls weren't concrete. They were lined with lead and acoustic foam. A clean room. I checked the radiation levels. Dropping. 1, 2 sieverts. Manageable. I moved deeper, weapon raised. The rooms here were offices, pristine, untouched by the decay outside. Papers were still stacked on desks. Coffee mugs sat with moldy rings in the bottom. I reached the main operations center for this sector. A dead body sat in the ergonomic chair, mummified by the dry, conditioned air. He was wearing a lab coat with the logo of a company I didn't recognize, Ethelgard Dynamics. I pulled the corpse aside, "Sorry, buddy," and woke the terminal. It was air-gapped, running on a backup RTG power source. This was the black box. I accessed the root directory. Files named Exodus, Containment, and Protocol Black. I opened the Protocol Black file. The text scrolled across the screen, and my blood ran cold. Subject: Asset Denial and Autonomous Purge. Trigger: Detection of organic respiration exceeding authorized parameters. Methodology: The facility is not a power plant. It is a sarcophagus. The core does not generate electricity. It generates a dimensional resonance field designed to suspend the entities discovered in the bedrock during the 1989 excavation. Protocol Black is the failsafe. If the field fluctuates, or if unauthorized entry occurs, the facility is designed to detonate the tectonic stabilizers, burying the site under half a mountain. I stared at the screen. The entities. The drone outside wasn't guarding a reactor. It was guarding a prison. And I had just rung the dinner bell. A tremor shook the floor. Dust drifted down from the ceiling tiles. The sterilization sequence wasn't just heat. It was the tectonic destabilizers warming up. Warning! The PA system returned. Seismic charges armed. Collapse imminent in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. I needed to get to the surface. But the lift was back the way I came, past the dead Ronin and whatever else was waking up. I scanned the map on the terminal. There was a secondary egress, a ventilation shaft for the heavy water exchange. It led up to the cooling towers on the ridge. I downloaded the data. All of it. The world needed to know what was sleeping beneath Fukushima. It wasn't just fallout. It was something that required Ethelgard dynamics to build a cage out of a nuclear plant. I grabbed a keycard from the dead scientist's lanyard and turned to leave. Movement caught my eye. At the far end of the clean hallway, the shadows were deepening. Not simply a lack of light, but a physical viscosity. The air shimmered like heat haze, but cold. Freezing cold. Frost began to spiderweb across the reinforced glass of the partition. The entities. The resonance field must be failing. I raised the P226, knowing it was useless. The shadow coalesced, taking a humanoid shape, but elongated, wrong. It moved in stutter steps, phasing in and out of visual reality. My Geiger counter fell silent. Not turned off, silent. The physics in the hallway were being rewritten. I turned and ran. I burst through the side door into the maintenance corridor. The ventilation shaft access was 50 meters ahead. I could hear the thing behind me, a sound like tearing metal and whispering voices. Don't look back. I reached the hatch. It was rusted shut. I slammed the pry bar into the wheel, wrenching it. The rust cracked. I spun the wheel, adrenaline overriding the pain in my shoulder. The hatch swung open, revealing a dark, vertical tunnel with a rusty ladder. I climbed in and slammed the hatch down, spinning the interior lock just as a heavy impact dented the steel from the outside. I scrambled up the ladder, the rungs biting into my gloves. The air grew hotter as I ascended. I was climbing alongside the heat exchangers. Suddenly my radio crackled. It had been dead for hours. Unit 7 report. We have seismic spikes in your sector. Did you trigger the payload? A voice. American accent. Military crispness. I fumbled for the transmit button. This is an independent salvage operator. I'm in the vent shaft. The facility is going critical. Who is this? There was a pause. A cold, calculating silence. Salvage operator. You are in a restricted exclusion zone under Article 9 authority. Hold your position for extraction. Extraction? The mountain is about to collapse. I'm getting out. Negative. You are contaminated. Leaving the containment zone constitutes a Class 1 biothreat. Hold position, or you will be neutralized. I stopped climbing for a split second, staring up at the circle of gray light far above. They weren't coming to save me. They were the cleanup crew. Protocol Black isn't a failsafe for the plant. I muttered to myself, realizing the final piece of the puzzle. It's a cover-up for the extraction team. The entities were the prize. I was just a loose end. I resumed climbing faster now. The heat was becoming unbearable. Below me, the hatch buckled again. The thing from the hallway was breaking through. Above me, a kill team was waiting to sanitize the site. I checked my gear. 1 flare. A half roll of duct tape. My knife. And the stolen hard drive. I reached a service platform halfway up the shaft. A heavy industrial fan blocked the path, its blades idle but massive. I squeezed through the gap between the blades, my suit snagging on the grime. As I pulled myself through, I saw them. through a grate in the side of the shaft, looking out into the main turbine hall I had fled earlier. A squad of soldiers in matte black armor, heavily modified. No insignia. They weren't fighting the drones. They were commanding them. They moved with a fluidity that spoke of genetic augmentation or cybernetic assist. One of them pointed up at the vent shaft. They had thermal. They saw me. Bullets sparked against the grate, buzzing like angry hornets. I scrambled higher, the ladder rattling against the wall. "Target acquired," the radio voice said, devoid of empathy. "Sanitize." I wasn't escaping a power plant anymore. I was in a war zone between an ancient horror and a Black Ops hit squad, and the mountain was ticking down to 0. I looked at the timer on my wrist. 6 minutes. I needed a distraction. I looked at the flare in my pouch. I looked at the grease-caked bearings of the massive fan above me. If I couldn't outrun them, I had to change the battlefield. I wedged the flare into the gap between the fan housing and the motor assembly. I pulled the pin. The magnesium sputtered, then roared to life, melting through the ancient grease and heating the hydraulic lines. I climbed, shielding my eyes. 30 seconds later, the hydraulic line ruptured. High-pressure oil hit the burning flare. FOM. The explosion rocked the shaft, sending a fireball roaring downward. It wouldn't kill the squad, but it would blind their thermals and choke the shaft with smoke. I used the chaos to scramble the last 50 feet. I hit the top hatch, gasping for air, and burst out onto the roof of the auxiliary cooling tower. The wind hit me. Cold, radioactive mountain air. The sky was gray, heavy with snow. I was out. But I wasn't free. I scanned the perimeter. To the east, the extraction team's V-22 Ospreys were circling, dark shapes against the gloom. They were scanning the ridges. I crouched low behind a vent stack. My shoulder throbbed in time with my heartbeat. I clutched the hard drive against my chest. 6 minutes until the seismic charges fired. I had to make it to the tree line, through the snow, while being hunted from the air. I took a breath of the thin air, tightened the straps on my pack, and began to run. The real nightmare had just begun. The air inside Sector 4 didn't just smell stale, it tasted like copper and ozone. A metallic tang that coated the back of my throat despite the filtration mask. My Geiger counter, clipped to my shoulder strap, was vibrating against my clavicle, a frantic, silent warning. I had disabled the audio ticker 3 floors up. Sound was a luxury I could no longer afford. Below me, through the rusted grating of the catwalk, the beams of tactical lights sliced through the suspended dust of the turbine hall. They were hunting in a diamond formation, disciplined and fluid. These weren't standard security contractors. The way they cleared the corners, weapons tight against their shoulders, barrels sweeping in overlapping arcs. This was Tier 1 kinetic cleanup. I checked my own loadout. The Glock 17 I'd scavenged from the dead guard in the lobby had 4 rounds left in the magazine. No spare. My primary weapon was the environment, and right now, the environment was trying to kill me faster than the death squad below. I shifted my weight, the corrosive dust crunching imperceptibly under my boots. I needed to reach the sub-level control annex. according to the schematics I'd pulled from the server room in Chapter 6. The only unmonitored hardline into the mainframe was located behind the secondary coolant pumps. If I wanted to know what Protocol Black actually meant before these professionals put a bullet in my brain, I had to get there. I waited for the point man to sweep his light past the vertical stanchion before I moved. I swung over the railing, boots finding purchase on a thick bundle of insulated conduit cables running along the wall. I descended hand over hand, the rubberized coating slick with condensation and grime. My muscles burned, the lactic acid buildup screaming for a rest I couldn't take. I dropped the last 6 feet, landing in a crouch behind a massive turbine housing. Silence returned, save for the low, rhythmic thrumming of the facility's dying heartbeat, some automated backup generator still cycling power to systems that should have been dead a decade ago. I moved low, utilizing the slicing the pie technique to clear the corner of the turbine. Clear. I sprinted across the open gap to the maintenance door, the heavy steel warm to the touch. The radiation levels here were spiking. My dosimeter watch read 4.2 millisieverts per hour. Not instant death, but hanging around here was literally burning time off my lifespan. I jammed a rusted pry bar into the door mechanism, leveraging it against the hydraulics. With a groan of tortured metal, it popped open just wide enough for me to slip through. Inside, the atmosphere changed. The industrial hum faded, replaced by a suffocating, pressurized silence. This was the Containment Administration wing. The walls were lined with lead glass, most of it shattered. I navigated the debris field, keeping my weapon drawn. A corpse sat in a swivel chair facing a bank of dead monitors. It wasn't skeletal. It was mummified, preserved by the dry, sterile air, but the uniform was wrong. It wasn't a TEPCO jumpsuit. It was a lab coat with a relentless, geometric logo I didn't recognize, Aegis Heavy Industries. I reached the central terminal. It was dead, but the hardline port was intact. I pulled the decryptor unit from my pack, a jury-rigged Raspberry Pi setup I used for urban exploration, and jacked it in. The screen flickered to life, amber text scrolling against the black void. System lockdown, Protocol Black active. I bypassed the handshake protocol using the admin key I'd scraped earlier. The files opened. My breath itched, fogging the inside of my mask. Protocol Black wasn't a shutdown procedure. It was a containment failure response for Biological Asset 04. I scanned the logs, my eyes widening. The earthquake in 2011 hadn't just cracked the reactor. It had breached a subterranean storage facility beneath the plant. The reactor meltdown was a cover story. The radiation wasn't leaking out simply because of damage. They were venting it in. They were flooding the sublevels with lethal radiation deliberately. Why? I whispered. I found the answer in a video log dated 2 days ago. The camera angle was high, looking down into the primary reactor vessel. Inside the core, amidst the melted fuel rods and the deadly blue glow of Cherenkov radiation, something was moving. It wasn't human. It was a shifting, biomass nightmare, weaving itself into the corium. And it was absorbing the radiation, feeding on it, growing stronger. Protocol Black was the order to incinerate the site with a tactical nuclear device to prevent Asset-04 from breaching the surface. The cleaners outside weren't here to secure the plant. They were here to sanitize the evidence before the bomb dropped. Contact rear! Sector 7. A voice crackled over a radio frequency I was monitoring. They found my entry point. I ripped the drive free. I had the proof, but no way to transmit it from this depth. I needed to get to the comms tower on the roof of the ventilation building. But between me and the exit stood a squad of highly trained killers and a hallway reading 500 millisieverts. Footsteps thundered down the metal corridor outside. I had seconds. I looked at the schematics on the wall. The only route bypassing the corridor was the maintenance crawlspace running directly over the spent fuel pool. Lethal territory. Without a lead-lined suit, I'd take a massive dose. It was a choice between a bullet in the head or radiation sickness. Breaching in 3, 2, 1. Flash bang. The explosion rocked the room, blowing the door off its hinges. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine. I didn't wait for the visual. I scrambled backward, kicking the grate off the ventilation shaft and diving in just as the room filled with suppressor fire. Bullets chewed up the drywall where my head had been a second ago. I crawled, elbows digging into the galvanized steel, dragging my body through the tight darkness. The heat rose instantly. The air shimmered. I was over the pool. The Geiger counter on my shoulder wasn't clicking anymore. It was emitting a solid, high-pitched tone, a flat line of warning. Asterisk high radiation area. Evacuate. Asterisk. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself forward. Every second in this tube was cellular suicide. I could feel it, a prickly heat on my skin, the metallic taste turning into the taste of blood in my mouth. My vision blurred at the edges. I had to focus. Tactical breathing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. I reached the intersection of the vents. Left went to the surface. Right went deeper into the core. I kicked out the vent cover to the left and dropped into a locker room, collapsing on the tiled floor. I fumbled for my medkit, ripping open a packet of potassium iodide and dry swallowing the pills. It wouldn't stop the damage already done, but it might keep my thyroid from cooking. I checked the Glock. 3 rounds. I stood up, swaying slightly. The cleaners were thorough. They would sweep the vents. I had to move. I pushed through the double doors into the hallway, raising the weapon. A silhouette stood at the far end of the hall. Not a soldier. It was tall, elongated, its limbs possessing too many joints. It wore the tattered remnants of a hazmat suit, fused to its flesh. It twitched, turning its head toward me with a sickening crack of vertebrae. The faceplate of the helmet was smashed, revealing not a face, but a pulsing, luminescent growth. Asset-04, I realized with horror. It wasn't just in the core. The containment had already failed. The creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and sprinted toward me, moving on all fours with impossible speed. Behind me, the heavy boots of the death squad echoed from the vent room. Hammer and anvil. I didn't think. I fired 2 rounds at the creature, center mass, double tap. The bullets impacted with wet thuds, slowing it but not stopping it. It lunged. I dove to the side, rolling through a shattered office window. Glass shards bit into my flank. I hit the floor and scrambled up, slamming the office door and shoving a heavy filing cabinet in front of it. The creature slammed against the door, the wood splintering. I looked around the room. A supervisor's office. One exit. A heavy blast door marked emergency venting protocol, manual override. If I opened that, I could flood the hallway with superheated steam from the secondary loop. It would cook the creature. It would also cook the squad coming up behind it. And if the seal on this office wasn't tight, it would cook me too. The door buckled under another blow. A claw punched through the wood, inches from my face. I grabbed the manual wheel on the blast door. It was seized with rust. I holstered the empty gun and gripped the wheel with both hands, screaming with exertion. "Come on!" I roared. The wheel turned. A hiss of escaping pressure became a roar. I spun it fully open just as the office door disintegrated. The creature poured into the room, a nightmare of teeth and tumors. I yanked the lever down. The world turned white. The roar of the steam vent drowned out the creature's scream and the gunfire from the hallway. I curled into a ball in the furthest corner, wrapped in my coat, praying the thermal insulation was enough. The heat was unbearable. It felt like the air itself was boiling. Then silence. The steam began to dissipate, sucked out by the emergency cyclers. I uncurled, gasping for air. The office was stripped paint and wet drywall. The creature was gone, washed away or retreated. The hallway was quiet. I checked the Geiger counter. The steam had carried radioactive particulate. The levels were critical. I stumbled out into the hall. The bodies of 3 soldiers lay near the vent, their Tyvek suits boiled to their skin. The way to the roof was clear, but my body felt like lead. I looked at my hands. The skin was red, irritated. Radiation burns. I wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. I was fighting for a legacy. I had to get the drive to the transmitter. The world had to know what was buried here before the bomb turned it all to glass. I began the climb to the roof, one agonizing step at a time, leaving bloody handprints on the railing. The air in sublevel 5 didn't just smell stale, it tasted like copper and ozone. A metallic tang that coated the back of my throat and refused to be swallowed. My Geiger counter was clipped to my belt, the audio muted. But the haptic feedback was vibrating against my hip with the frantic intensity of a trapped insect. I checked the display, 3.8 sieverts per hour. The numbers were climbing. I had maybe 40 minutes before the cellular degradation became irreversible. Before the invisible fire cooking my insides turned accurate tactical movement into a clumsy stumble. But radiation was a slow killer. The men hunting me were instantaneous. I pressed my back against the cold, sweating concrete of a maintenance alcove. Checking the magazine of the P226 I'd scavenged from the dead guard in the funicular station. 7 rounds. 7 rounds against a paramilitary hit squad equipped with thermal optics, level 4 body armor, and a mandate to bury Protocol Black under a mountain of silence. I closed my eyes for a second, regulating my breathing. In holdout? The panic was a wild dog in my chest. I had to keep it leashed. If my heart rate spiked, I'd burn through my oxygen faster, and in this heavy, pressurized depth, every molecule of air felt borrowed. Footsteps echoed from the catwalk above, heavy, rhythmic, disciplined. The cleaners. That's what the manifest in the security booth had called them. They weren't standard facility security. They moved with the predatory silence of operators who had spent too much time in the dark places of the world. Sector 4 Alpha clear. A voice crackled, distorted by a bone conduction headset but audible in the dead silence of the vault. Reading trace thermal signatures in the ventilation grid. He's cornered. Flush him. A second voice commanded, deeper, devoid of empathy. Protocol dictates 0 witnesses. Initiate the venting sequence for the upper ducts. Drive him down to the core. Venting. They were going to flood the upper levels with whatever caustic coolant or gas they used to scrub the systems. I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the rat in the pipes. I looked at the rusted schematic riveted to the wall next to me. The only way forward was down, deeper into the belly of the beast, toward the geometric anomaly marked simply as the sarcophagus. I moved. Low crouch, weight on the balls of my feet, weapon held tight to my chest to minimize my profile. I slipped from the alcove into the main corridor of sublevel 5. The lighting here was emergency red, bathing the brutalist architecture in the color of dried blood. Shadows stretched and twisted, playing tricks on my peripheral vision. Or maybe it wasn't the lights. The radiation sickness was starting to manifest. Dizziness, visual artifacts, the shimmer that the journal entries had warned about. I reached a heavy blast door labeled Main Control/Observation Deck. The keypad was dead, fused by some past electrical surge, but the manual override wheel was intact. I holstered the pistol and gripped the cold steel. It groaned, a shriek of tortured metal that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, waiting for the shout, the beam of a flashlight, the crack of a suppressed carbine. Nothing. Just the low, thrumming vibration of the facility's heart. I heaved the door open just enough to slip through, sealing it behind me. The room beyond was a cavernous command center, a graveyard of analog technology. Rows of dust-covered consoles faced a wall of reinforced lead glass 3 feet thick. And through that glass, I finally saw it. I saw Protocol Black. It wasn't a reactor. Not in any conventional sense. Suspended in the center of a silo that plunged hundreds of feet down was a sphere of vantablack fluid, defying gravity. Rippling with a chaotic energy that hurt to look at. Massive coolant pipes fed into it, but they weren't cooling it down, they were feeding it. The fuel rods from the reactors above, the official reason for this plant's existence, were merely batteries to keep this thing contained. The fluid pulsed, and a wave of nausea hit me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. The Geiger counter on my hips screamed a silent warning, the vibration turning into a continuous buzz. The sphere was a breach. A tear in the fabric of physics, held open by nuclear fire. I scrambled toward the central terminal, praying the data drives were still accessible. The screen flickered to life, amber text scrolling rapidly. *Project IZ Enami. Status critical. Containment integrity 12%. Asterisk. I scanned the logs. The meltdown in 2011. It hadn't been an earthquake. It hadn't been a tsunami. The records here showed the seismic event originated inside the facility. The entity, whatever was in that sphere, had tried to push through. The radiation released wasn't just fallout. It was a byproduct of the dimensional friction. The government hadn't evacuated the zone to protect people from cancer. They evacuated it to hide the fact that reality was thinning. System purge imminent, a synthesized voice announced, echoing through the command deck. Sanitization of biological assets initiated. Biological assets. Me. The heavy thud of magnetic boots hit the metal grating of the gantry behind me. I spun around, raising the P-226. 3 of them, clad in matte black armor that seemed to absorb the red emergency light, their faces hidden behind multi-eyed tactical optics. They didn't shout freeze. They didn't ask for surrender. The point man raised a suppressed vector, the laser designator painting a green dot on my sternum. I dove behind the console just as the glass shattered above me. Sparks showered down as bullets chewed through the vintage electronics. Target acquired. Control room, the point man stated calmly. I returned fire blindly, 2 shots over the desk, just to keep their heads down. I needed an exit. I scanned the room. To my right, a pressurized airlock leading to the gantry that spanned the sarcophagus chamber. It was suicide. The radiation levels inside the chamber would be instant death without a hazmat suit. But staying here was a bullet to the brain. Then I saw the secondary console. Asterisk manual venting, auxiliary coolant. Asterisk. If I vented the coolant, the fog would fill the room. It would blind their thermal optics if the steam was hot enough, and it would create chaos. But it would also destabilize the sphere. Flanking left! One of the cleaners shouted. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my fist onto the emergency release button. A siren wailed, a sound like a dying animal. High-pressure valves blew overhead, and a wall of superheated white steam blasted into the room, screaming with the force of a jet engine. The thermal shock was immediate. The room turned into a sauna from hell. Contact lost. Visuals obscured. I moved. I scrambled on hands and knees, keeping below the worst of the heat, heading for the airlock. Bullets zipped through the steam, sparking against the metal floor inches from my face. I reached the wheel of the airlock, my hands blistering from the heat of the steam. I spun it, the gears grinding. The door hissed open. I rolled inside and slammed it shut, engaging the lock just as a spray of bullets hammered the viewing port. Silence returned, heavy and oppressive. I was on the gantry now, suspended over the abyss. I turned to look at the sphere. Without the thick lead glass of the control room, the presence of the thing was overwhelming. It felt like a magnet pulling at the iron in my blood. The air here crackled with static electricity so intense my hair stood on end. My skin felt like it was sunburned, tight and hot. I looked down at my hands. The veins were dark, black lines tracing up my forearms. The sickness was accelerating. The sphere was reacting to me, or I was reacting to it. The black fluid rippled, forming shapes, faces, hands, that pushed against the surface tension. Across the chasm, on the far side of the silo, was the service elevator to the surface. The final exit. But between me and that elevator was 100 feet of narrow, rusted grating, suspended over the pulsing heart of a nightmare. The door behind me groaned. The cleaners were cutting through. Sparks flew from the hinges. I started to run. The sphere pulsed again, louder this time, a physical thud that shook the bridge. The metal groaned under my feet. And then the voice, not from the speakers, but inside my skull. A chorus of whispers, overlapping, screaming. Asterisk open. Asterisk. The facility lights died completely. Pitch black. Then, the emergency strobes kicked in. Flash. Darkness. Flash. Darkness. In the strobe light I saw them. Not the cleaners. Climbing up the sides of the silo, emerging from the shadows beneath the sphere, were the failures. The biological assets that hadn't been sanitized. Humanoid shapes, elongated, their skin pale and sloughing off, fused with the facility's machinery. Wires weaving through flesh. They moved with a jerky, insectal speed. The door behind me blew inward with a concussive blast. The cleaners poured onto the gantry, their weapon lights cutting through the gloom. I was in the middle. The kill squad behind me. The abominations below and ahead. And the sphere, pulsing, ready to burst. I checked my gun. 3 rounds left. I didn't aim at the cleaners. I didn't aim at the monsters. I aimed at the hydraulic coupling holding the gantry to the wall. If I couldn't run, I'd turn this bridge into a slide. I'd ride the wreckage down to the maintenance access ring below the sphere, bypassing the trap. Or I'd fall into the void and become part of the experiment. Protocol Black is compromised, I whispered into the roar of the facility. I pulled the trigger. The Geiger counter clipped to my chest rig wasn't clicking anymore. It was emitting a solid, static scream that vibrated against my sternum. I was pinned behind a slab of reinforced concrete in Sector 4, the heart of the subterranean complex, while 56mm rounds chewed away the edges of my cover. This wasn't just a cleanup crew. The movements of the 3 operatives advancing down the gantry were too fluid, too synchronized. They moved like fluid dynamics simulation, pouring over obstacles rather than climbing them. Their gear was matte black, devoid of insignias, absorbing the strobing emergency lights of the reactor hall. They were the implementation of Protocol Black. I checked the magazine in my rifle. 7 rounds. My sidearm had 3. The heavy ceramic plate in my vest was cracked from the impact it took in the corridor. And every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, the telltale metallic taste of acute radiation exposure. But I had the drive. The heavy, ruggedized hard drive dug into my side, warm and humming. It contained the truth that had been buried here since 2011. Surrender the asset. A voice boomed, not from a loudspeaker, but synthesized directly into my headset on an open frequency. It was a cold, digital affectation. Containment is mandatory. You are in breach of Article 9. I pulled the pin on my last flashbang, counting the heartbeats. Article 9 doesn't exist. I rasped back, my voice wrecked. And neither does this plant, right? I tossed the canister over the concrete lip. The detonation was a white void that swallowed the shadows. I surged upward, rifle raised. The thermal optics on my mask cut through the afterimage. 2 of the operatives were staggering, their advanced HUDs likely overloaded by the proximity of the blast. I dropped the point man with a double tap to the thoracic joint of his armor, the only weak point I'd identified in previous skirmishes. He folded instantly. The second operative was faster, recovering with inhuman speed. He raised his weapon, but I was already moving, sliding across the polished metal floor toward the control console. I fired my remaining rounds in a suppressive arc, not aiming to kill, but to force him behind the turbine housing. The bolt locked back on an empty chamber. I slammed into the console, my fingers flying over the tactile keyboard. The terminal was still active, displaying the frantic red geometry of the facility's status. The cooling pumps weren't just failing, they had been deactivated manually. That was the deepening mystery of Protocol Black. As I scanned the scrolling logs, the horror crystallized. The facility wasn't trying to contain the radiation. It was refining it. The glowing tanks I'd passed in Chapter 9 weren't waste storage. They were incubators. The logs referenced isotope-induced cellular regeneration and combat efficacy at 500 Roentgens. The operatives hunting me. They weren't wearing the heavy lead-lined suits because they were afraid of the radiation. They were wearing them to keep the radiation in. They were the batteries. A bullet sparked off the console inches from my hand. I didn't flinch. I initiated the override sequence, not to shut down the reactor, but to flush the coolant system. It was a suicide play. A thermal shock venting that would turn this entire sector into a steam cooker within 30 seconds. Protocol Black confirmed. I whispered to the recorder running on my vest. Subject creates biological dependency on ionizing radiation. We are not dealing with a cleanup. We are dealing with a harvest. I hit execute. The facility groaned. It was a sound like the earth splitting open, a deep, resonant basso that shook the fillings in my teeth. Warning klaxons shifted from a rhythmic pulse to a continuous, deafening wail. System purge imminent, the automated voice declared, indifferent to the violence. Venting in T-10. The remaining operatives hesitated. Even conditioned supersoldiers understood physics. The superheated steam from the primary loop would melt flesh from bone regardless of cellular regeneration. They broke cover, retreating toward the blast doors. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted for the maintenance hatch I'd spotted on the schematics. It was a narrow, rusted aperture designed for drone repair units, leading directly into the outflow tunnels. I scrambled through, the hard drive slamming against my ribs, just as the main valves blew. The roar behind me was apocalyptic. A wall of white pressure slammed into the hatch, searing the heat seals. I was in darkness, sliding down a 40-degree incline of slimy, algae-slicked piping. The air here was thick, smelling of ozone and rot. My suit's Geiger counter was maxed out, the needle buried. I was taking a lethal dose every minute I stayed here. I hit the bottom of the chute, splashing into thigh-deep water. It was warm, unnaturally warm. The tunnel stretched out into the gloom, illuminated only by the bioluminescent fungi growing in the cracks of the concrete, another side effect of the local ecology the government had hidden. I ran. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were filled with cement, but I ran. The tactical display on my wrist flickered and died, the electronics fried by the ambient radiation. I was flying blind. Something moved in the water ahead. A shape, elongated and pale. It wasn't an operative. It was one of the failures. A discarded asset. It thrashed in the dark water, misshapen limbs clawing at the walls. I bypassed it, ignoring the wet, gurgling sounds it made, a human voice stripped of humanity. Protocol Black didn't just make soldiers, it made monsters. Light. A grate ahead. The moon. I hit the grate with my shoulder, screaming with effort. It was rusted shut. The water level was rising, the facility flushing its toxicity into the sea. I drew my sidearm, jammed the muzzle against the hinges, and fired my last 3 rounds. The metal shrieked and gave way. I burst out onto the rocky shoreline, tumbling onto the wet stones of the Pacific coast. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow. I scrambled away from the outflow, clawing up the embankment until I collapsed in the tall grass, gasping, retching. Silence returned to the hills. The facility was just a hum in the ground beneath me now. I lay on my back, staring up at the stars. They looked blurry. I pulled the hard drive from my pocket. The casing was hot, but the light was still blinking green. The data was intact. The blueprints, the genetic logs, the identities of the politicians who authorized the use of Fukushima as a breeding ground for post-human weaponry. My vision tunneled. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the sickness. I fumbled for my emergency beacon, cracking the seal and holding the transmitter up. It pulsed a silent signal to the extraction drone holding pattern 5 miles offshore. I looked at my hand. The skin was reddened, the veins dark. I had survived the plant, but I knew the cost. I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a carrier. A shadow fell over me. I flinched, expecting the black armor of the operatives. Instead, the silent, sleek shape of the extraction drone hovered overhead, dropping a harness. As I hooked in and felt the lift tug me from the poison earth, I looked back at the power plant. It stood silent, a concrete tomb against the night sky. The mystery wasn't over. Protocol Black was global. I had seen the IP addresses in the logs. This was just one node. I clutched the drive to my chest. They would come for me. Let them come. I had the fire now, and I was going to burn their whole world down. Extraction complete, I muttered, watching the coastline recede. Let's see how they handle the fallout.